Thanks for joining us for today's webcast, Think Preventive When Planning Your Fairy Ring Program, presented by Syngenta and taught by Lane Treadway, PhD. My name's Lisa Wick. I'm GCSA's Senior Manager of E-Learning Programs and will be today's moderator. We are recording today's event, and you'll have access to that recording as part of our follow-up email. Your audio is muted in this system, but if you have a question, you can either click the raise hand button and I can unmute you, or you can type that question in the question answer box. Today's session is eligible for 0.1 GCSA education points. At the end of the program, we'll give you that code that you can type into the education section of the website to get those points. We hope that you'll find today's webinar valuable. It's brought to us in partnership with Syngenta. Syngenta is proud of its decades-long support of GCSAA. Their commitment to superintendents and their courses goes far deeper than just innovative products. Syngenta is committed to providing superintendents technical support, education, and strategic partnerships to help grow the game while shining a spotlight on the crucial role superintendents play in the golf industry. Lane Treadway, PhD, is a senior technical representative with responsibilities for turf and landscape in the southeastern United States. In this role, he works with turf managers, sales representatives, and university specialists to develop effective management programs for important pest problems. Treadway earned his bachelor's degree in agronomic science from Penn State University, his master's in plant biology from Rutgers, and his doctor's in plant pathology from the University of Georgia. Please join me in welcoming today's presenter, Lane Treadway, PhD. Lane?
Okay, thank you, Lisa, and thanks to everybody out there for joining us this morning to talk a little bit about fairy ring and how to better control it. One thing is for sure that fairy ring does come in many different shapes and sizes, and I'm showing here just a few pictures to shows some of the different symptoms that can be caused by fairy ring and some of the different fungi that can cause this disease in turf. Some people are of the opinion that fairy ring is actually a beautiful disease. I am not one of those. I don't like it, I don't like to see it, and my main goal here is to control it more effectively. And I'm sure that most people on the line join me in that way of thinking. And so hopefully after today I'll give you some information and some tips that will help you to control fairy ring more effectively on your golf course so that you don't have to see these kinds of symptoms. One thing is also for sure, the reason why fairy ring comes in so many different shapes and sizes is because it's a very complicated disease. In fact, without question, it's the most complicated turf disease that there is. And there are several different reasons for this complicated nature to the fairy ring disease. Number one being, I alluded to this earlier, there are many different fungi that can cause fairy ring. I've lost count, and I think most people have lost count, but most people throw out the number of 60 plus different basidiomycete fungi have been documented to cause fairy ring in turf grasses. So we're not just dealing with one pathogen here, we're dealing with 60 or perhaps even more. And they're not all the same. They're different in terms of when they grow, how they cause disease, what fungicides they respond best to, and this is a big part of the reason why fairy ring control is so variable. Because we're dealing with a population of different pathogens and not just one single pathogen like we do with typical turf diseases like dollar spot or brown patch. Another complicating factor is that the fairy ring symptoms vary and can change over time. Even if you monitor one single fairy ring caused by one single pathogen, the symptoms that pathogen induces can change during the course of the year. And we'll talk about how those symptoms are induced, how they transition over the course of the year, and how that can play into your management approach. To make it even more complicated, fairy ring symptoms are actually caused through several different mechanisms, and we'll talk about these mechanisms in some detail later. But depending on what you're seeing out there, those symptoms can actually be caused by different factors, different phenomenon occurring in the turf and in the soil. And finally, curative control of fairy with fungicides is very erratic and frankly very unreliable. And this is a big part of the reason why fairy control has been so ineffective historically, is that we've mostly approached the disease from a curative standpoint. And as the title to this morning's seminar implies, I want you folks to start thinking more about truly preventing fairy, because this is when fungicides become much more effective and we can manage the disease more reliably. I alluded to the many different pathogens that can cause fairy, and this is just a small sampling of the 60+ different pathogens that are out there. And so, this is why there's not one solution, there's not one answer to fairy. The best management approach can vary considerably depending on if you're trying to control a puffball species in a sand-based putting green versus an agaricus type fungus in a soil-based fairway. The management approaches can vary quite considerably.
And I believe you wanted to do a quick poll next, Lane.
Yes, that's right.
We actually have two back-to-back here. So here's the first one.
Okay, so just go ahead and tell us where on your golf courses are your most severe fairy problems. Greens, tees, fairways, or roughs. As I mentioned, the management approaches can vary quite a bit depending on where on the golf course you're dealing with fairy issues.
And closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and there's your results.
Okay, so we have a pretty even split of greens and fairways. That's interesting. I would have expected a more of a slant towards issues on greens, but perhaps it's due to the fact that most of our greens are on a fairly routine preventative fungicide program, not just for fairy but for other diseases in general. And it's fairways where fungicides are used a lot less frequently. And so maybe that's where why we're dealing with more issues on fairways. Okay, so the next question is, what type of fruiting bodies do you see? I showed you some pictures of some of the different types of pathogens that can cause fairy ring. Of course, you have your traditional stem and cap type mushrooms, like the mushrooms you buy in the grocery store. You can have puffball fungi, which don't have a stem. It's just a sort of a marshmallow looking structure that's embedded down in the thatch layer. You can have jelly-like fungi that can cause fairy ring. Do you see multiple types out there on the golf course, or do you see none? That's a possibility as well. In some cases, you might not see the fruiting bodies on a regular basis. So go ahead and tell us what you're seeing out there.
You want to make any guesses, Lane, on what's your top vote here?
I think it's going to be pretty scattered. I'm going to say you're going to get a lot of mushrooms, a lot of puffballs, a lot of multiples, and a lot of none.
See, you're so good. And so no jelly-like. Is that?
Yeah, those are pretty rare.
I wondered.
Yeah, I put that in there just to come up with a fifth one, just on the odd chance that somebody might see that sort of thing. Okay, good. So that gives me a much better understanding of what you folks are dealing with, and we'll go from there. And I'll be sure to focus the discussion on those issues as we go forward. So grab control here again. Maybe. There we go. Okay. So to make farrowing just a little bit more complicated, we also have these terms that have been used, Edaphic farrowing and Lectophilic farrowing. And I believe that these terms were coined by Houston Couch. He used them in his textbook and used these terms quite a bit. And so you still do hear these terms thrown about out there. To me, they're confusing and they don't really have much utility. But we need to clear up some sort of misconceptions about these terms and what they mean before we go forward. So Edaphic farrowings are mainly what we're talking about here. These are the farrowing fungi that grow in the soil and or the thatch layer that cause, you know, your typical farrowing type symptoms. What Dr. Couch called a lectophilic farrowing is actually a different disease. It's more commonly known as superficial farrowing, and you also see it referred to as white patch in some of the turf pathology textbooks. These are different pathogens. They're different fungi. They primarily grow actually in the canopy of the turfgrass and also in the thatch. And most of them directly infect the turfgrass and directly cause damage to the turf. And so in this way, these lectophilic farrowings are actually very different from the soil-dwelling farrowings that we're talking about here. The management is very different. The symptoms are quite different. And so it's really a separate disease and a separate issue. Don't make the mistake of confusing an Edaphic farrowing and a superficial farrowing. Because the superficial farrowings are actually relatively rare, and these pathogens are growing actually in the canopy of the turf, not down in the thatch and in the soil. So let's move on and focus on those Edaphic farrowing issues, because these are definitely the most common that we deal with in golf course turf. And one major distinction there with these Edaphic or soil-dwelling farrowing pathogens is that most of them never directly infect the turfgrass. These actually aren't pathogens, in that they don't directly parasitize the turf or infect it in any way. These farrowing fungi are just growing in the soil, using the dead organic matter and thatch as a food source, and growing through the soil and sort of minding their own business. By doing so, however, these farrowing pathogens cause changes to the soil. They change either the chemical properties or the physical properties of the soil, and it's those changes in the soil properties that indirectly cause the symptoms that we see on the turf. So even though these farrowing pathogens never directly infect the turfgrass, they do actually cause symptoms indirectly by changing the soil properties. And that's a very important thing to understand when we talk about farrowing management, especially curative farrowing control. Because once you see symptoms on the turf, those symptoms are not being induced by the pathogen. They're being induced by the changes that have occurred in the soil. And so for curative farrowing control, you need to focus on changing the soil back to normal and not necessarily controlling the pathogen. And this is why fungicides just don't perform consistently on a curative basis for farrowing control. Once you see symptoms, you have a soils problem, not necessarily a fungal problem. So those symptoms that are caused by farrowing, as I mentioned before, can vary over the course of the year. These symptoms are generally divided into 3 different types or categories based on how they look and how the turf is being affected. They're type 1, type 2, and type 3. And this generally follows the progression of symptoms that we see in the turf during the course of the year. The type 2 symptoms are generally what we see early in the season, and those are just simply rings of dark green or more quickly growing turf. And then later in the season, those often transition to type 1 rings where the grass is being killed or badly damaged. And then during periods of heavy rainfall, especially late in the season, we tend to see flushes of mushroom or fruiting body production. So those are the 3 different types of symptoms that we deal with. And it is important to remember that these symptom types don't refer to the ring itself. They only refer to the symptoms that are evident at a given point in time. Because as I said before, the symptoms associated with a particular ring can change during the course of the year. So just to show you some pictures here, this is your typical type 2 fair ring symptom on a creeping bentgrass putting green, and you're just simply seeing greener turf, more active growth in that affected area. And this is simply caused by the release of nitrogen and other nutrients into the soil. That fair ring pathogen is breaking down organic matter in the soil as it grows through it, and that in turn is causing the turf to be darker green and to grow more actively. Of course, this can be very unsightly and definitely detracts from the uniformity of the turf, especially from an appearance standpoint, but also potentially from a playability standpoint. It's hard to argue, though, that the turf is being damaged because actually the affected turf might actually be more healthy because it's got adequate nutrition. And definitely these type 2 fair ring symptoms are most evident and most problematic in under-fertilized turf. On the left-hand side here is a fertility trial that was going on at NC State University one day, and you see the fair ring symptoms there, and it was interesting to note that you could pretty much only see the type 2 fair ring symptoms in the plots that are either under-fertilized or receiving no fertilizer whatsoever. On the right is, I believe this is a Bermudagrass putting green in Thailand, and these greens were pretty significantly under-fertilized as well, and they were dealing with chronic type 2 fair ring problems as a result. So to a certain extent, these type 2 fair ring symptoms can be masked or partially managed with adequate nutrition, especially nitrogen, and sometimes even an iron application can help to even out the color a little bit more and make these fair ring symptoms less evident. Okay, so the type 2 fair ring problems aren't necessarily a huge issue, but they are an indicator that something bad is developing in the soil. Because as I mentioned before, these type 2 fair ring symptoms can often lead into type 1 symptoms later in the season as we accumulate more heat and drought stress. What happens is, in most situations, that infested soil and thatch begins to turn hydrophobic, and you start to see wilting in the outer perimeter of the ring, as you see here on the left on this creeping bentgrass. And if you take a soil profile from the edge of that ring, you can see that the sand is starting to turn dry. You see how light colored that sand is, and it's completely dry and powdery. And that's because this upper layer of the thatch is starting to turn hydrophobic or water repellent, and this turf is basically dying from drought stress because no water is infiltrating down into that soil profile. And later in the season, as we continue to accumulate more heat and drought stress, that affected turf will collapse and die completely. And again, this turf is not dying because it's been infected by a pathogen. It's dying of drought stress because the pathogen has caused the thatch to turn hydrophobic. So at this point, a fungicide application is not necessarily going to help. You need to focus on returning the soil properties back to normal from a physical and a chemical standpoint, and then think about controlling the pathogen to prevent the problem from recurring. Okay, so in most cases, as I alluded to, the fair-ring pathogens cause type 1 symptoms on turf by releasing these hydrophobic compounds that coat the thatch and soil particles and cause the turf to die from drought stress. However, there are other mechanisms by which fair-ring pathogens can cause type 1 symptoms. There are some cases, and Mike Fidanza, who's on the line with us here this morning, has done some work along these lines to show that in some situations it's an accumulation of ammonium to toxic levels in the soil profile that actually damages the turf. And so that can be a significant issue, especially during periods of heat and drought stress. There are other fair-ring pathogens that have also been shown to release hydrogen cyanide or other toxic compounds into the root zone. And it's those compounds that, that ultimately kill the turf. Okay. So, but as I mentioned before, hydrophobicity does seem to be the most common cause of these type 1 symptoms that I see, especially on sand-based putting greens. This is a picture from Lee Miller that was published in one of the golf course management articles that's linked in the handout section on the webinar. And this is amazing here, and it shows you just how powerful this hydrophobic coating that develops can be. This water droplet at the tip of the white arrow here on the right was placed on that thatch 2 days before the picture was taken. In 2 days, that droplet has not infiltrated into the soil. So is there any wonder that eventually this creeping bentgrass is going to die from drought stress? There's zero water getting into that soil profile. The orange coloration that you see in the thatch layer here, that's evidence of fair-ring activity, and we think these are the hydrophobic compounds that are left behind coating the thatch and sand particles. So oftentimes you will see that orange layer that's developed in the soil profile when you have a fair-ring issue. And as I'll talk about later, the depth of this orange layer can help you to pinpoint how much water you need to be watering in your fungicide applications with. As I mentioned before, though, there are situations where hydrophobicity is not the reason why the turf is dying, and this is just a couple of examples of those. This picture on the left was taken in Florida on a Tiff-Eagle Bermudagrass green probably about 10 years ago. This is a very interesting situation. The rings were small, and I still don't know what fungus this was, but it was producing small puffball-like fruiting bodies underground in the thatch layer and in the soil. But there was no hydrophobicity evident in the soil whatsoever. The soil was moist and appeared relatively normal, but the turf was dying. So we speculated that there may have been a toxin or perhaps toxic levels of ammonium that were being produced in this situation. Another unusual situation on the right, this is on seashore paspalum in the Dominican Republic, and they were dealing with sort of a unique fair-ring type pathogen there, and again it was killing turf and causing significant damage to the seashore paspalum, but there was no evidence of any soil hydrophobicity. And in fact, they noticed that when they aerified an area, it would immediately recover from any damage that appeared. And this green square that you see here, in fact, was hollow tine aerified just once a couple of weeks prior to my visit. And you see how dramatically it responded. So we speculated that there may have been gaseous compounds that were released from the soil that allowed that turf to recover that was being produced by the fair-ring pathogen. So, you know, that's one of the complicated aspects of this disease is that it can cause disease in many, many different ways. And then, we have the type 3 symptoms, and these are just simply the production of mushrooms or other fruiting bodies around the outer perimeter of the fair ring circle. And these are not necessarily a problem, especially on greens where you're mowing every day. Usually they'll get clipped off and you'll just be able to see sort of the stem embedded down in the thatch layer. These can be a lot more problematic on fairways and roughs where you're not mowing as regularly, and so maybe you need to send a crew member out there to clean these things up on a day when you're not mowing, so it becomes a bit of a labor issue at times.
So Lane, before you go on, somebody's put in the question answer box. So not to go back, but are the jelly-like signs also considered what is called squidge in the UK and some areas of the US?
I have not heard that term. If I know Dr. Fidanza is on the line with us, if there's a way that he could enter a answer into the chat box or the question and answer, I'd appreciate that. If you heard that term or know anything about it, Mike, let us know.
Great, thank you.
So, I alluded to this before, but the point cannot be overstated that curative control of fairing with fungicides is just very erratic and very unreliable. And this data here is an excellent example of that. This does come from Mike Fidanza at Penn State, and this was sort of an early curative fairing trial, I believe on a creeping bentgrass fairway, where they had some type 2 fairing symptoms evident out there on the turf. They went out and they made 2 applications of these treatments on July 22nd and a second application on August 19th. And this data was collected on September 2nd, about 2 weeks after that second application. Okay, and you see here that we applied ProStar, Heritage, and Endorse all at the high label rates, 2 applications, and we essentially have had no effect on the fair ring symptoms whatsoever. Now look what happens when we apply Revolution, a soil surfactant, a soil wetting agent. We have a dramatic effect on the fair ring symptoms. And when we mix a fungicide along with the soil surfactant, they do not provide a statistical benefit over the soil surfactant alone. It does appear that Heritage plus Revolution is a little better here, but in fact that is not a statistically significant difference. So the bottom line here, the way we need to approach fair ring control from a curative standpoint is we need to focus on returning those soil properties back to normal. And perhaps in this situation, since we were dealing with type 2 fair ring symptoms, perhaps the Revolution helped to leach out some of the excessive nitrogen that had accumulated in the soil profile, or perhaps there was some hydrophobicity that was developing in the profile as well, and the Revolution helped to mitigate that. Another example was published in Golf Course Management. This is from an article that was written by Drs. Fidanza, Bruce Martin, and Frank Wong, and Steve McDonald as well. This is one of the data sets that was in that article from Bruce Martin's trial in South Carolina, again looking at curative fair ring control with either fungicides alone or fungicides plus Revolution. And you can see that the fungicides alone, Heritage, Insignia, ProStar, really didn't have a major curative effect, although ProStar did reduce the symptoms to some extent. Where we add the soil surfactant into the mix, that's where we're helping to alleviate the symptoms. So again, we're helping to return those soil properties back to normal and allow the turf to recover. Okay, so another factor that we need to consider for those of you that are dealing with fair ring primarily on putting greens, we talked about how there are 60 different pathogens that can cause fairing. Well, on sand-based putting greens, it's actually a lot more simple than that. Lee Miller at NC State did a fairly comprehensive survey of fairy ring pathogens on sand-based putting greens across the United States several years ago. And you can see the states that he sampled here. And we were expecting to find a tremendous diversity of different pathogens. In fact, we only found 3. And these are in samples from between Florida to California to Hawaii to Virginia and Wisconsin. We only found 3 pathogens causing fairy ring in sand-based putting greens. And all 3 of them were what we call puffball species. And these are the ones that don't have a cap. They're not like the mushrooms that you buy in the grocery store. They're just a sort of a marshmallow-like structure that's embedded down in the thatch. And so these are the primary pathogens that we're dealing with in sand-based putting greens. On fairways, for those of you that are more interested in fairy ring on fairways, we do see these pathogens on fairways, but there's a much broader diversity of fairy ring species out on the fairways. And so a lot of the research that I'm going to talk about here this morning directly applies to these puffballs from a product evaluation standpoint. And so I feel very confident that our results that we see in Florida and in North Carolina are going to apply to other areas very well because we're dealing with the same pathogens on putting greens. On fairways and other native soil areas, you know, the results don't necessarily translate there. So just sort of a disclaimer there as far as that goes. So, you know, we spent a lot of time talking about how complicated fairy ring is. And it is certainly complicated when you look at the science behind it. But in reality, from a management standpoint, I think fairy ring is actually really, really simple if you look at it this way. Basically, you know, these fairy ring fungi are growing on the thatch and the organic matter in the soil profile. And their growth changes the physical and or chemical properties of the soil. And this in turn leads to changes in the appearance of the health and or appearance of the turfgrass. So bottom line is, to make fairy ring management very, very simple, it's a 2-step process. If you're dealing with a curative control of fairy ring, you need to change the soil properties back to normal. And that could include cultivation. It could include applying soil surfactants. It could include adjusting your fertilizer applications, whatever it takes to change the soil properties back to normal and make the turf more uniform. And then, you know, step 2 for curative control is to implement a preventative fungicide program to prevent that fungus from returning and continuing to grow through the soil profile. Okay, from a preventative standpoint, basically, you know, your goal is the same. You want to apply preventative fungicides on a regular basis and maintain soil properties that are favorable for the turf with regular applications of soil surfactants and regular cultivation and sound fertilization practices. So when you boil it down like that, fairy ring management is actually quite simple. And so, you know, I really want to emphasize here that fungicides can't be thought of as a short-term fix for fairy ring. They're a long-term preventative approach. And there are a lot of different tools that you have at your disposal for fairy ring management from a fungicide standpoint, and I think I have a comprehensive list of all those that are available here for you. As far as the standalone active ingredients, basically we have DMI fungicides that I'm sure everybody is familiar with. You have the QOI fungicides like Heritage and Insignia. You have the SDHIs, which most people are familiar with ProStar, which has been a standard for fairy ring management for a long time. And then we have the newer products, the newer SDHIs, like the Lista and Exemplar that have also shown some efficacy against fairy ring. And finally, you have Polyoxin D, affirm or endorse that has some activity as well. And then we have a ton of different combination products, most of which are QOI plus DMI combinations like Brisquet and Headway, which are combinations of Heritage with either difenoconazole or propiconazole. We also have Heritage Action, which is Heritage plus acebenzolar that's labeled for fairing control. So you have a lot of different tools at your disposal. And my contention would be that when you think about managing fairing, don't just think about it, don't just pick a product that's going to control fairing. Pick your products that are going to control fairing and all the other disease issues that you're trying to manage, and try to integrate your fairing prevention program into the rest of your fungicide program so that you can hit two birds with one stone as much as possible. One of the problems we've had with fairing management historically is we've approached it separately, and we've made a lot of special dedicated fairing applications that really weren't benefiting us in control of any other diseases. And so that makes it very expensive. But if you choose products that are controlling fairing and summer patch and take-all patch and Bermudagrass decline and a lot of your other disease issues that you're dealing with, then it becomes a lot more economical and you're getting much more out of the products that you're applying. Okay. So just to focus on the prevention and some of the keys to effective fairing prevention using your cultural practices and also regular fungicide applications. It is very important to employ regular cultivation, whether it's hollow tine aerification and top dressing, or solid tining or regular spiking throughout the season as well. And also regular application of soil surfactants to maintain those uniform soil properties. That is a very important first step to fairing management. Next step, when it comes to your fungicide program, it is important to initiate preventative applications early in the season, generally when your soil temperatures reach about 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit is the time in the spring when you need to think about beginning your fairing prevention program. And this is about the time when other pathogens like summer patch start to become active as well. So again, you can hit two birds with one stone with a lot of these applications. You do want to make sure that you deliver the active ingredient that you're applying to the infested zone of the soil profile. And this involves watering that application in, either immediately after application or within 24 hours, depending on the chemistry that you're using. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. And from there, it's important to make repeat applications on regular intervals to maintain consistent suppression of the fairing pathogens in the soil. There's no one product, there's no one application that's going to control fairing for the entire season. Certainly these early spring applications help tremendously, and they help you to form a very good foundation for your fairing prevention program. But to truly prevent fairing throughout the entire season, it takes regular applications, just like every other turf disease that we deal with. We almost never go out and just make one application in the spring and expect that to last all year long with dollar spot or brown patch or any other turf disease. We start early in the season when the pathogen becomes active, and we continue as long as the pathogen is active. And we need to do that same thing with fairing. Okay, so irrigation and watering in our fungicide applications is a very important consideration. As we talked about before, these are soil-dwelling organisms that are down in the thatch and in the organic matter. And so if you just make a foliar application and let that fungicide sit on the foliage, it's not going to work. You need to make sure you're putting that active ingredient down in the soil. There are really no hard and fast rules here as far as how much water or when to water in, but I am going to give you some general tips. As far as the amount of water, you need to have some idea of how deep the fairy ring pathogen is in your soil profile. And a lot of this depends on the age of the turf and the depth of the thatch layer. In newer greens, like you see in the upper right here, oftentimes that fairy ring pathogen is going to be limited right up at the top in the organic layer that's developed during the grow-in of the greens. And you can see the white fluffy material right up here in the upper half inch or so. That's the fairy ring pathogen that's growing there. And so in this situation, maybe you only need 1/10 of an inch of irrigation, 0.15 inches of irrigation at the most to make sure you get the active ingredient down into this depth. Now, this is an example. A lot of people would make the mistake of calling this a superficial fairy ring. It, in fact, is not. This is a soil-dwelling Edaphic fairy ring. It just happens to be closer to the surface in the thatch layer. And the bottom right here, you can see that this fairy ring fungus is deeper, 2 to 3 inches deep in the soil profile. This is an older green, and we have an accumulation of organic matter deeper in the profile. And so in this situation, maybe we need 1/4 inch of irrigation to deliver the active ingredient that deep in the profile. Now that's a lot of water. That's oftentimes more water than you can put out on a green in just one irrigation cycle. And so oftentimes what you might have to do is hit it with 1/8 of an inch immediately after application, and then maybe another 1/8 of an inch later that night to get the full amount of water that you want to put out. And related to that, the timing of your watering in, there's no one single answer here either. It depends on the chemistry that you're using and the solubility and the speed of the absorption of the active ingredients that you're applying. So for example, products like Heritage, Banner, or the combination products like Headway or Briskway, all these active ingredients are relatively soluble, and they're not absorbed into the foliage very quickly. And so we found that these products can be applied in the morning and then watered in that night prior to the next mowing, and we still see very effective control of fairy ring and a lot of other soil-borne diseases as well. Valista, which is our new SDHI fungicide, is a little bit different in that this chemistry is absorbed into the plant very quickly. It actually adheres to the waxy layers on the surface of the plant. And so we do need to make sure that we water Valista in immediately after application or very soon after application before it adheres to the foliage so that we can get the active ingredient down into the soil profile. And when we do that, we see very, very effective fairy ring control from Valista, as I'll show you here in a little bit. Now, we get the question a lot about whether or not we need to tank mix our preventative applications with a soil surfactant. And it's not necessarily harmful to put a soil surfactant in the tank with your preventative applications, but it's not absolutely necessary either. As long as your turf is on a regular soil surfactant program, we found that your preventative applications can go out separately and be watered in, and they're very effective. Where soil surfactants are necessary is where you have any hydrophobicity that's developed or you haven't used wetting agents on a regular basis. In that case, you need a soil surfactant to help the fungicide penetrate into the affected area. And this is probably one reason why fairy ring continues to be a more chronic issue on fairways as well, because we're not applying soil surfactants nearly as regularly on fairways as perhaps we are on greens. Okay, so from a preventative standpoint, I already mentioned that we want to begin our preventative fungicide applications in the spring when our soil temperatures get up to about 55 to 60 degrees. I just wanted to show you some of the research that went into coming up with that general guideline. And what we wanted to do is to have a more soil temperature based recommendation for fairy ring, just like we do with all of our other soil-borne or root-infecting diseases like spring dead spot and summer patch and take-all patch. We never really had a clear recommendation on when to initiate a fairy ring program. And again, all this research was done on stand-based putting greens targeting puffball fungi, and so these results are most appropriate for that type of situation. And this is research that again is referenced in one of your handouts by Lee Miller at NC State. And what he did is he was applying different fungicide treatments, some registered products and some experimentals, and he just made one application of each of those fungicides when his 5-day average soil temperatures reached 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, or 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So we had a very broad spread of soil temperatures, and just made a single application and monitored the development of fairy ring from there. And he did this over the course of the 3 growing seasons, 2007, 8, and 9. And we got the most clear differences in 2007, and basically all of the preventative treatments worked very well between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The 75 degree Fahrenheit application here actually ended up being curative because we started to see some symptom development just before that application was made, and so that's why it was not nearly as effective as any of these others. Okay, so you do see a few treatments here that that are a little bit lower than the rest of them, and that's 55, 60, and 65. Those tend to be a little bit better during the course of the season. And then in 2008, we didn't have any statistical differences. There's a lot of variability, but you see 60 degrees sort of seems to distinguish itself here a little bit. And then in 2009, again, no differences and a lot less fairy ring developed in that year, but again, 55 and 60 seem to have a little less fairy ring. So that's where we came up with this 55 to 60 degree threshold as a general recommendation for fairy ring prevention. Now, as you see, it's not a life or death thing. You don't have to run out there and make an application on the very day when your soil temperatures hit 55. There's some wiggle room here with fairy ring, and since the disease develops slowly over time, it's the timing isn't so precise. So, you know, 55 is good, 60 is good, maybe 65 is good as well. You just need to make sure that you initiate a preventive program early in the spring prior to the development of any symptoms. And so just to show you some pictures here from those same trials, this is in 2007, the first year. Balaton or Lynx applied at 1 ounce, just one application at the 65 degree soil temperature mark, and this picture was taken on June 13th, and you can see that both are providing very effective fairy ring control up until that point. And then some other pictures here, again from 2007, untreated on the right, Balaton applied at 65 degrees on the left, very effective fairy ring prevention there. Now eventually late in the season these treatments would break down as the summer progressed, and so that's why I say there's no one single treatment that's going to control fairy ring for the entire season. These early spring applications can form an important foundation, but fairy ring control needs to be approached on a regular basis. Another mistake I think we've made with our fungicide recommendations on fairy ring in the past is we've typically always recommended high rates on long intervals. So for example, the recommendation with Heritage TL would have been 2 fluid ounces on a 28-day interval. Well, this trial we did actually showed that lower rates on a more regular interval was a lot more effective than those higher rates on a long interval. And so what we have here is Heritage TL at 1 ounce every 14 days or 2 ounces every 28 days, both of which would have been watered in with a 1/4 inch of irrigation. This was a deep fair ring that was 3 or 4 inches deep in the soil profile, so we needed a lot of water to get the AI down there. Both of these plots received revolution on a 28-day interval. So the amount of revolution in both of these heritage treatments was exactly the same. But you see the difference here. We're getting much more effective fair ring control when we apply 1 ounce of heritage on a 14-day interval as opposed to 2 ounces every 28 days. So again, just another example of how regular applications for fair ring control can be a lot more effective. Just to show you pictures of these plots, this is the plot that was receiving heritage at the 2 ounce rate every 28 days. All of these applications would have been tank mixed with revolution. And then this is the plot that was treated with the low rate of heritage every 14 days. And you can see some fair ring kind of bleeding over from the untreated plot on the left, but very effective fair ring prevention from that lower rate every 14 days, which would have been tank mixed with revolution every other time. Okay, so that's just one of the experiences that I had that led me to believe that a programmatic approach was very important for fair ring management and was going to be a lot more effective than just single products applied sporadically over the course of the growing season. And with the tools that we have at our disposal today, there's no reason why we need to make special dedicated fungicide applications that just control fair ring anymore. We can control fair ring plus a lot of your other soil-borne root infecting diseases with a lot of the same applications. And that's exactly what we do in our Syngenta agronomic programs. These programs are designed to control fair ring, and they do prevent fair ring very, very well. But there's no single application in here that's targeted just for fair ring. We're always targeting fair ring and summer patch and take-all patch or Bermudagrass decline or some other important disease issue that you're trying to prevent. And so, as I said before, you get a lot more out of these products when you use them in that way. And so we've been researching these fair ring prevention programs and showing very, very effective results. And this is just one example where we're looking at different programs, different versions of our Syngenta agronomic program, and you can see the complete program at the bottom, providing complete fair ring control. The way that these other treatments differ is we're taking certain products out of the rotation. And so when we take Heritage Action out of the rotation, you can see that we got some fair ring breakthrough that occurred. So obviously the Heritage Action applications as part of this complete program were contributing a significant amount of fair ring prevention. One other product that I wanted to bring your attention to from a fair ring prevention standpoint is Valista. And most of you are probably familiar with Valista at this point. It's our new SDHI fungicide that we launched last year at the Golf Course Industry Show. But it has shown very, very effective activity on fair ring. This is the same class of chemistry as ProStar. It's the SDHI class of chemistry, but Valista represents really the 4th generation of SDHI fungicide, and it's an evolution of the chemistry through tweaks in both the active part of the molecule and in the side chain. We've been able to develop a molecule that's much more active against a broader range of different turfgrass pathogens. And so that's basically what we have with Valista. We have an active part of the molecule that interacts better with a broader diversity of turf pathogens, and we have a side chain that helps it to penetrate better into the target site in the fungal cell. And so that gives us broader spectrum activity. And in fact, Valista is the broadest spectrum SDHI that's available on the turf market. And this is one reason why it's such a useful tool for farrowing is that the same applications are going to help to prevent a lot of your other disease issues like summer patch, for example, and spring dead spot as well. Just to show you some of our more recent results on farrowing prevention with Valista. This is a trial that was done by Jim Kearns and Matt and Martin at NC State in Wilmington, North Carolina. And this was sort of a preventative trial, but there was also a little bit of a curative aspect to it as well, because there were some lingering farrowing symptoms remaining from the previous year that I'll show you here in a couple of seconds. But these applications were made early in the season on March 12th and on April 13th, and then watered in with 0.2 of an inch of irrigation immediately afterwards. And this data was collected on June 17th. And you can see here Lexicon, Valista, and Brisquet all providing very effective control. Exemplar and Tartan sort of moderate control, and Mirage actually did not have a significant effect on the disease. So just to show you some before and after pictures, on the left is a picture of the plot taken on the day of the first application, and so you can see some of the lingering farrowing symptoms from the previous year still evident there. And then on June 17th, about 4 months after the first application, you can see we've prevented any additional farrowing activity, and we've helped the turf to recover from a lot of those lingering symptoms. Brisquet, the combination of Heritage with difenoconazole, was very effective as well, and we don't see the growth regulating effects on ultra-dwarf Bermudagrass greens from difen like we do with some of the other DMI fungicides. And then Mirage, it may have controlled the farrowing pathogen, but the severe growth regulating activity on the ultra-dwarf Bermudagrass inhibited any recovery from occurring, so you're pretty much right where you started from there after those two applications. Okay, just to show you a couple of other examples of our success with Valista in farrowing management, we've been doing a lot of larger plot field demonstration trials in Florida on Bermudagrass greens. This is Estero Country Club and some of the farrowing that he sees during the summer on the Bermudagrass there. And so in this example, this was an early curative farrowing trial. The rings were showing some type 2 symptoms, and we went out and made Valista applications at either 0.5 or 0.7 ounces and compared that to 4 ounces of ProStar. And you can see here on June 22nd, we see a very effective reduction in the farrowing symptoms, and we prevent any return of those symptoms afterwards. The 0.5 ounce rate actually wasn't very effective. Just increasing the rate a little bit up to 0.7 made a huge difference in the efficacy of Valista in this circumstance. All these treatments were applied without a soil surfactant and were watered in immediately with between 1/8 and 2/10 of an inch of irrigation. And we intended to make multiple applications of these treatments over time, but when the superintendent saw how effective that 0.7 ounce rate of Valista was, he wanted to go out and treat all the greens, and who are we to stand in his way? So here's looking at the 0.7 ounce, the green treated with 0.7 ounces on day 0, and then 15 days after that application. You still see some lingering type 2 farrowing symptoms, but they're much less pronounced than they were on the day of the application. With ProStar, we just did not see a significant effect. The rings continued to expand. The symptoms are still very pronounced, and it really didn't provide significant control at all. This is a trial also at Estero Country Club, but this was done on greens where the farrowing was a little more further along and starting to show some type 1 symptoms. And we made one application on June 22nd without a wetting agent. And you can see here on up until July 6th, those treatments essentially had no effect whatsoever. Then we came in and made a second application of all these treatments on July 6th, and added 2 ounces of duplex and watered them in immediately, and then you can see a dramatic reduction, especially with that 0.7 ounce rate. So for curative applications, 0.7 ounces mixed with a soil surfactant seems to be best in terms of helping to suppress the symptoms and preventing the symptoms from recurring by suppressing the pathogen. And just to show you pictures here, this is from that trial 13 days after the first application on the left, and you can still see some pretty pronounced fair-ring symptoms there. But just 4 days after the second application, the high rate with the duplex, the symptoms are much less pronounced. Okay, so to conclude, before we wrap up and hopefully take questions, if anybody's still on the line with me, it is possible to achieve fair-ring prevention, but we just need to approach it in a very simple way in terms of making regular fungicide applications to prevent the growth of the pathogen, and employing sound cultural practices to maintain favorable soil conditions for the turf. We need to make sure that we're delivering our fungicides into the infested zone in the soil profile by watering in to make sure we're getting the most out of our fungicide applications. Preventative applications generally do not need to be tank mixed with the soil surfactant, but curative applications generally do, and we saw several examples of that here this morning. And with our currently available products, fair-ring can be prevented along with other diseases as part of a comprehensive program. We no longer need to make special dedicated fair-ring applications anymore. Okay, thank you very much. And before I conclude, I just want to make a shout out to Dr. Verdanza and his Twitter account and his Frisky Fair-ring Friday hashtag. If you follow that, you'll see some pretty cool pictures of fair-ring, but hopefully after this morning, we'll see more pictures of turf that doesn't have fair-ring because you're doing a better job of preventing it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Lane. Lots of great information. We do appreciate Syngenta and you taking time to put this information together for us. Education points are up to each individual on this one. Your approval code is 999-16180-23413. And for those listening to the on-demand recording, make sure you put in the date that you are listening, not the original date of the event. There are a couple of questions here. Lane, going back to the research that you showed that was written up in GCM, we'll start with those.
Yeah.
Any reason Revolution was chosen? Is there any difference with other wetting agents?
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe that research was actually supported by Aquatrol, so obviously that was the primary driver there in choosing Revolution. I've not seen a major difference between the different soil surfactants that are out there from a fair-ring management standpoint. They all essentially have the same effect in making the soil moisture more uniform. So how to choose a particular product really boils down to what fits best for your soils and your irrigation practices and what else you're trying to achieve. From a fair-ring management standpoint, I've just not seen a major difference amongst the different soil surfactants that are out there.
Okay, you talked about and showed some pictures that had more thatch than others. And this question goes back to, does the fungi mass affect the amount of product needed to control?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Potentially, if you have a fair-ring that's just up there in the upper half an inch, maybe you could control that with a low rate of a fungicide, for example. But if it's really deep and you're spreading that active ingredient across a deeper portion of the soil profile and diluting it, maybe you do need a higher rate in that circumstance. As far as I know, nobody's really done the research to that level, but it certainly makes sense.
Okay, and I'm going to say this wrong. Are Rhytocontazae preventative applications compromised or enhanced with watering in Valista immediately?
What was that term again?
Yeah, rhizocon, Rhizoctonia.
Oh, rhizoctonia, probably.
There you go.
It depends on the amount of water. If you're watering in with 1/10 or 1/8 of an inch, I would say you're still going to get very good rhizoctonia control. More water than that, it's probably going to start to negatively impact your control of rhizoctonia. And so it does become a question of what is your priority with that application. Because if you water in for control of fair ring, summer patch, spring dead spot, etc., you are going to be reducing or limiting the activity on the foliage. And so maybe you need to make a separate application of a different fungicide to control those foliar diseases.
Okay. I am seeing, whoop, here's the next question. It goes back to squidge. I've only seen squidge on fine fescue lynx courses. Typically appears in the late summer or early fall. So there we go.
Okay, that's a new one on me.
We do have a number of other webcasts coming up in April and into May. Again, your approval code for this one, 999-16180-23413. See no other questions. Thanks again, Lane, for teaching for us today. Lots of great information. Ooh, I know what else I was going to say. Is you talked a little bit about development of the agronomic programs and showed that example and pointed to Greencast Online. We also have Mike Fidanz, or excuse me, not Fidanz, I knew I'd do that. Mike Agnew presented a Building an Agronomic Approach webcast that is available on demand that folks can take a look on the webcast page and help them develop a program similar to what you showed there, Lane. Seeing no other questions, we'll adjourn for today. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.